The scene looks like something from a distant conflict zone, not the heart of America's third largest city. Armored vehicles roll slowly through downtown intersections. National Guard troops in combat fatigues stand watch outside municipal buildings. The wail of sirens echoes off glass towers while crowds gather on street corners, some holding signs, others simply staring in disbelief at soldiers patrolling their neighborhoods. This is Chicago in 2025. Armored vehicles roll slowly through downtown intersections. National Guard troops in combat fatigues stand watch outside municipal buildings. The wail of sirens echoes off glass towers while crowds gather on street corners, some holding signs, others simply staring in disbelief at soldiers patrolling their neighborhoods. This is Chicago in 2025. President Trump has called the city's leadership a criminal enterprise and demanded their immediate arrest. Federal forces have been deployed over the objections of state officials. Separate courtrooms are hearing simultaneous legal challenges over whether the president even has the constitutional authority to send troops into American cities without local consent. From a distance, watching cable news or scrolling social media, it might look like sudden chaos, an unexpected eruption of disorder requiring immediate military response. But on the ground, for those who've lived through years of mounting pressure, this moment feels like something entirely different. It feels like the inevitable breaking point, the moment when a struggling city, stretched beyond its capacity, finally snaps under weight it can no longer bear. Chicago hasn't arrived at this crisis overnight. For years, the city has been operating on borrowed money and borrowed time. Debts have accumulated. Essential services have deteriorated. New financial pressures have emerged faster than solutions. The infrastructure of urban life, both physical and fiscal, has been slowly crumbling beneath a surface that looked stable from the outside. Now, that facade has shattered. A political confrontation between Washington and Illinois has spilled violently into the streets, exposing wounds that can no longer be concealed or managed through public relations and accounting maneuvers. But here's what most coverage misses. This confrontation over National Guard deployment isn't really about who controls military forces or even about immigration enforcement. It's a symptom of something far more fundamental, a country straining dangerously under its own accumulated weight. The same economic forces that hollowed out factories and gutted working-class neighborhoods over the past generation are now testing the very limits of government functionality itself. The systems we've depended on to maintain order, deliver services, and hold communities together are buckling. As the sirens eventually fade and the immediate drama passes, the real story becomes visible. This isn't a tale of sudden collapse. It's the story of long, slow decay, the kind that eats away at foundations for years before the structure visibly fails. What's unfolding in Chicago right now reveals with brutal clarity how debt, inflation, and political dysfunction have become so entangled that even America's strongest, richest cities can no longer stand independently. They're propped up by financial engineering, temporary fixes, and desperate hope that somehow the math will improve. And the cracks spreading through Chicago's streets won't respect city boundaries. They're already appearing in municipal budgets from coast to coast, warning of a broader unraveling that no amount of military presence can prevent. How federal troops ended up patrolling American streets. Armored military trucks now occupy intersections that were, until very recently, patrolled exclusively by local police officers wearing blue uniforms and driving civilian vehicles. Nearly 500 National Guard troops have been deployed across Chicago under a presidential emergency order that bypassed normal coordination with state leadership. Approximately 300 soldiers came from Illinois units, technically under the governor's command. But another 200 were flown in from Texas, a deliberate signal that federal authority would prevail regardless of local cooperation. The official justification for deployment came after weeks of escalating tension. Rising crime statistics dominated headlines. Protests erupted over aggressive immigration enforcement operations. Then came the catalyzing event, the fatal shooting of 28-year-old Celio Vargas Gonzalez by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents during a raid that went tragically wrong. Within hours of troops arriving on Chicago streets, Illinois state officials filed emergency lawsuits in federal court. Their argument was straightforward. This deployment violated fundamental principles of state sovereignty and the constitutional restrictions on using military forces for domestic law enforcement. The Posse Comitatus Act exists precisely to prevent this kind of federal military intervention in civilian affairs. Since the deployment, crowds have filled downtown streets continuously. The response from Chicago residents reveals deep divisions in how people perceive both the crisis and the solution. Some neighborhoods, particularly those that have experienced the worst violence and property crime, genuinely welcome the military presence. These residents express hope that visible shows of force will finally bring calm after a summer that saw record levels of retail theft, carjackings, and random street violence. For them, the troops represent order, a sign that someone, somewhere still has the capacity and will to restore stability. But other communities see the same soldiers through entirely different eyes. To them, this isn't protection, it's occupation. The presence of armed troops patrolling civilian streets represents the clearest possible proof that government at all levels has completely lost control of crises it helped create through policy failures and neglect. The National Guard's actual mission remains frustratingly unclear, even to the soldiers themselves. Federal officials frame the deployment as immigration support operations, assistance to ICE agents conducting raids and deportations. But many observers, including military analysts, view it as political theater designed to project strength and dominance rather than solve any specific operational problem. President Trump himself has been characteristically blunt in explaining his reasoning. We're going to make our country very safe. We're going to make our cities very, very safe. Chicago is a mess. You have an incompetent mayor. The president has repeatedly characterized Chicago as a hellhole plagued by uncontrollable crime. This rhetoric persists despite police data showing that most major offenses, including homicides, have actually declined sharply over the past year. The disconnect between political narrative and statistical reality has become just another source of confusion and mistrust. Images of military vehicles positioned outside City Hall spread rapidly across social media platforms, drawing immediate comparisons to previous federal interventions in Portland and Detroit. Civil rights organizations issued urgent warnings that using federal forces to police American citizens sets a profoundly dangerous precedent, one that could fundamentally reshape the relationship between military power and civilian governance. But beneath the constitutional debates and political theater, a different kind of frustration runs through Chicago's neighborhoods. It's a frustration that predates Trump's announcement, that goes deeper than any single policy dispute or partisan battle. Chicago's communities have been burdened for years by relentlessly rising costs, steadily shrinking public services, and rapidly fading trust in leadership at every level. The National Guard's arrival didn't cause this breakdown. It simply revealed it, pulled back the curtain on structural problems that have been festering for far too long. What's unfolding now represents the inevitable consequence of years of dangerous imbalance. Debts were ignored or refinanced rather than addressed. Budgets were patched with temporary fixes rather than reformed structurally. Promises were made on the basis of borrowed money that would need to be repaid by future generations. Beneath all the shouting, the lawsuits, and the dramatic street confrontations lies an uncomfortable truth that few want to acknowledge directly. Chicago has been stretched to its absolute limits, desperately trying to contain problems that money and manpower can no longer solve through conventional means. The National Guard might quiet the streets temporarily. Visible military presence might deter some criminal activity or discourage some protests. But soldiers in camouflage can't fix the underlying mathematics driving this collapse. They can't repair balance sheets or restore solvency to pension funds. They can't make the fundamental arithmetic of municipal finance suddenly work. That struggle, the real crisis, began long before the first military truck rolled down Michigan Avenue. The financial abyss. How Chicago's numbers stopped working. Chicago's municipal finances have reached a breaking point that, honestly, just defies easy comprehension. Consider this staggering fact. The city now carries more pension debt than 44 entire U.S. states. More than $53 billion in unfunded promises to retired workers, obligations that must be paid no matter the city's ability to generate revenue. Think about what that number actually means in practical terms. Nearly a quarter of every single revenue dollar that flows into Chicago's coffers goes immediately toward keeping those pension funds alive, servicing debt, and preventing the complete collapse of retirement systems. That's money that never reaches any actual city service. It doesn't fix potholes or pay police officers or keep libraries open or ensure garbage gets collected. Even with constant tax increases and endless refinancing schemes, the deficit keeps widening, like a wound that just won't heal no matter how many bandages are applied. Chicago now owes more per resident than any other major American city, over $45,000 per taxpayer when you combine pension obligations with general municipal debt. For context, that's roughly equivalent to a year's salary for many working-class Chicago residents. Every man, woman, and child in the city would need to contribute that amount just to bring the books to zero before funding a single day of actual city operations. To prevent the entire system from collapsing immediately, city officials have resorted to an increasingly desperate series of short-term fixes. New borrowing to cover old debt, delayed payments pushed into future budget years, higher fees imposed on virtually everything, water bills, parking, permits, licenses, fines. But, these financial bandages come with their own costs, and those costs are now becoming visible in ways that statistics can't fully capture. As taxes rise relentlessly, residents leave. It's that simple and that devastating. Since 2020 alone, more than 80,000 people have moved out of Chicago, taking their jobs, their consumer spending, and their tax contributions with them. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are families deciding that the city they loved no longer makes economic sense. These are young professionals choosing other markets for their careers. These are retirees fleeing property tax bills that have become genuinely unaffordable on fixed incomes. Businesses follow the same inexorable logic. When the tax burden becomes too heavy and the service quality too poor, companies shift operations to suburban locations or relocate entirely to states where the fundamental mathematics look more sustainable. This creates a vicious cycle that feeds on itself with accelerating velocity. Rising taxes push productive residents and businesses out. Their departure shrinks the tax base. The shrinking tax base forces officials to raise rates even higher on those who remain. Higher rates push more people toward the exits. Round and round it goes. Meanwhile, new financial pressures keep emerging faster than anyone can address them. Since 2022, Chicago has spent more than $350 million providing housing, healthcare, food, and services for migrant families arriving in the city. That figure could realistically double to $700 million by 2025 as arrivals continue and costs compound. These are human beings with genuine needs, but the financial reality remains unavoidable. The city was already drowning before this humanitarian challenge arrived. Basic maintenance has become a luxury the city can barely afford. Potholes remain unrepaired for months or years. Garbage collection has slowed to the point where residential streets sometimes go weeks between pickups. Police staffing has fallen to its lowest level in decades, with hundreds of vacant positions going unfilled to save salary costs. What's left is a city running almost entirely on debt and delay. Officials trapped between relentlessly rising costs and rapidly shrinking public trust. Every empty storefront and every closed school building marks the quiet, accumulating cost of financial decay that doesn't make headlines, but that fundamentally transforms the lived experience of urban life. Chicago's numbers might look like simple local mismanagement, the result of corrupt politicians or incompetent administrators. but they actually reflect something much larger and more troubling. They reveal a systemic problem where borrowed money has completely replaced genuine economic growth as the foundation of public finance. They show us where the first visible cracks in the broader national economy are already appearing, literally breaking through the pavement of city streets. Chicago is the canary in the coal mine, and the air is getting very thin. The federal shadow: how Washington's debt became Chicago's crisis. America's debt crisis no longer lives only in Congressional Budget Office reports and Washington policy debates. It's now actively shaping daily reality in every city budget across the country. The federal debt has climbed beyond $37 trillion, a number so large it becomes almost meaningless to human comprehension. To put it in terms that matter for actual governance, the U.S. government now spends more than $1.2 trillion every single year just on interest payments. That's more than the entire defense budget, including every aircraft carrier, nuclear weapon, and military salary combined. Every borrowed dollar that goes towards servicing interest represents money that can never be spent on housing programs, education grants, or infrastructure funding, the kinds of federal support that once kept cities financially viable. What looks like a distant accounting problem in distant Washington hits local governments like Chicago as missing revenue and rising costs that nobody can adequately explain to angry constituents. Federal transfers that once covered substantial portions of key municipal programs, housing assistance, education funding, public safety support, are shrinking rapidly in real terms. During the 2000s and early 2010s, Washington provided nearly 20% of Chicago's annual operating budget through various grants, reimbursements, and revenue-sharing programs. Today, that figure has fallen below 12%, forcing the city to fill widening gaps with increasingly unpopular local tax increases. At precisely the same time, inflation has driven up virtually every cost a city faces. The price of asphalt for road repairs has increased over 90% since 2020. Fuel for buses and emergency vehicles is up 40%. Food costs for school meal programs have risen more than 25%. Chicago can't print dollars to cover these differences. Unlike the federal government, which can simply create money through Federal Reserve operations, cities face hard budget constraints. They have only two possible choices when revenues fall short: raise taxes again, or cut services deeper. That squeeze defines everyday life for millions of urban residents who never read budget documents or follow municipal bond markets. Police vacancies remain open month after month to save salary costs, leaving fewer officers to respond to calls. Public transit systems reduce service hours and eliminate routes, making it harder for working-class residents to reach jobs. Property owners watch their tax bills jump year after year, while the neighborhood stores they've shopped at for decades close under the weight of higher fees and falling customer traffic. Inflation functions as an invisible tax, simultaneously draining city budgets and family savings. It hits everyone but falls hardest on those with the least cushion to absorb economic shocks. While Washington politicians argue over trillion-dollar spending packages in abstract terms, city officials face concrete decisions: close public libraries or cancel after-school programs, reduce fire department staffing or delay infrastructure repairs. Each choice represents real harm to real people. The higher federal debt climbs, the heavier the burden shifts onto local and state shoulders. It's a mechanical process, like water flowing downhill. Reduced federal capacity means reduced federal support. Reduced support means local governments must either raise more revenue or provide fewer services. Either choice erodes the social contract between citizens and their government. Chicago isn't failing in isolation, as if it's uniquely dysfunctional or poorly managed compared to other American cities. It's feeling the concentrated pressure of a national system where promises have systematically outpaced resources for decades, and where every new dollar created through deficit spending deepens the ultimate strain on governments closest to the people. The inflation trap. When every cost rises and nothing works, Inflation has transformed every existing weakness in Chicago's finances into a widening, accelerating wound. Since 2019, the city's annual operating expenses have climbed by more than 60%. Meanwhile, revenue has grown at barely half that pace, creating a gap that widens every year regardless of what officials do. The price of asphalt needed for road repairs has nearly doubled. Fuel for buses and emergency vehicles costs 40% more than it did just a few years ago. Labor contracts contain automatic cost of living adjustments, meaning salaries rise with inflation whether or not the city can afford it. Even basic routine maintenance, replacing streetlights, repairing water mains, clearing storm drains, now drains budgets that previously covered comprehensive community programs. When every cost increases while each dollar buys less, the system begins to quietly suffocate. Services deteriorate not through deliberate cuts, but through the gradual inability to maintain previous standards. To keep pace with these rising expenses, Chicago has relied on steady, relentless tax increases. Property taxes have jumped nearly 30% over the past decade, making Chicago one of the most expensive cities in the entire Midwest for homeowners. Middle-income families who once anchored entire neighborhoods, teachers, nurses, small business owners, city workers, are leaving in growing numbers. They're not fleeing crime or weather, they're fleeing mathematics. The numbers simply don't work anymore for families trying to build stable lives. Each departure means fewer customers for local stores, fewer students for schools, leading to closures and consolidations, less income flowing into city coffers. The cycle feeds on itself with merciless logic. Rising taxes push people out. Lost taxpayers force the city to raise rates even higher on those who remain. Higher rates push more people toward the exits. Meanwhile, new costs continue appearing faster than any possible solutions. Since 2022, as mentioned, Chicago has spent more than $350 million providing housing, healthcare, food, and services for migrants. City officials have warned publicly that this total could exceed $700 million by 2025, even as shelters fill far beyond their intended capacity and strain every support system. Hospitals face overcrowding. Schools must accommodate students who speak dozens of different languages. Police departments already stretched thin must respond to new challenges. What began as a humanitarian imperative has become a financial emergency that no existing budget line can adequately absorb. For ordinary residents, the decline manifests in countless small, frustrating ways that never make national news, but that fundamentally alter quality of life. Longer wait times for 911 emergency calls, fewer garbage pickups, leading to overflowing bins and vermin problems, slower snow removal in winter, making streets dangerous, closed storefronts that once housed family-run businesses operating for generations. Each missing service, each deteriorating piece of infrastructure, erodes a little more public confidence in the city's ability to recover. Trust drains away as visibly as water from a cracked reservoir. Chicago's fundamental problem is no longer just debt, though debt remains crushing. The deeper problem is momentum, the psychological and economic inertia of decline. Decline creates fear. Fear fuels flight. Flight deepens the fiscal hole, which creates more service cuts, which generates more decline. This is how a major American city slides from temporary strain into long-term stagnation. Not through a single catastrophic collapse, but through thousands of daily signals that stability is slipping away and that the trajectory points only downward. The illusion of rescue. Why printing money makes everything worse. Washington's answer to every crisis over the past several years has followed the same pattern. Print more money and call it rescue. During the pandemic, trillions of dollars poured into the economy. The $2 trillion CARES Act, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, additional stimulus packages, enhanced unemployment benefits, direct payments to families, forgivable business loans. For a brief moment, the strategy seemed to work brilliantly. Markets bounced back sharply from their lows. Jobs returned faster than economists predicted. Politicians from both parties claimed success and took credit for saving the economy. But those dollars didn't simply disappear into productive investment. They flooded into prices instead. By mid-2022, inflation hit 9.1%, the highest level in 4 decades. And every city budget in America began feeling the aftershock as the purchasing power of tax revenue collapsed while costs exploded. For Chicago, the illusion of rescue faded with brutal speed. Federal aid that arrived in 2021 helped patch some holes in pension obligations and funded temporary housing programs. But inflation erased much of its real value before it could be effectively deployed. Construction projects that received approval before 2022 now routinely run 30 to 40% over budget, forcing the city to borrow additional funds just to finish work that was supposedly already funded. New road projects get delayed indefinitely because the money allocated 5 years ago can no longer buy the same amount of materials and labor. Each new round of federal stimulus, no matter how well-intentioned, pushes local costs even higher through a predictable mechanism. Contractors raise prices because they can, because they know government money is flowing and competition has decreased. Wages climb across every sector as workers demand compensation for their eroded purchasing power. Materials become scarce as global supply chains struggle to keep pace with artificial demand. It's a feedback loop built on good intentions and catastrophically bad mathematics.